Well, thank you, Sam. I appreciate that. I was never running from you. Now I'm running to you. So I guess it's come full circle. But thank you so much for inviting me here. Thank you, 242 Church, for having me here. My great joy to be here with you, to be able to teach. We're teaching out of Matthew 14, and so I invite you to turn there with me if you have a Bible with you in whatever form you use your Bible, in book form or app form. Find Matthew chapter 14. I've already preached this morning. I've had a great time this morning downtown at Westside, but really looking forward to spending this time with you this afternoon. And so, again, as Sam said, my joy to be able to teach out of Matthew chapter 14. We're looking at verses 22 to 33. It's a passage, as we're going to see a lot of things in it. There are going to be a number of things that I'm going to highlight. But what I would like you to understand right from the very beginning is that it is a passage where we're going to see Jesus interact with his disciples, but not only interact with his disciples, but interact with his disciples as they experience difficulty. That's really important for us to understand. If we're going to glean some things from this text and take them and apply them to our lives, we must see that right from the very beginning. As I said, lots of things that we're going to see, a number of truths I'm going to highlight coming out of these verses. But what I would like to offer on the front end, in addition to that first statement, is this. This event that we see here, one that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, is an event that doesn't simply record a point of history in the ministry of Jesus, but is an event that serves as what I would call a living parable. We know what spoken parables are. They are simply, if you want to use a simple definition, they are earthly stories that pack in them heavenly meaning. There are more to them than that, but that's a nice, helpful definition. An earthly story that evidences things of the kingdom, of Jesus, of who God is, and so forth. But then I would suggest there are events in the ministry of Jesus, in the gospel accounts of his life, that serve as living parables. In other words, like I said just a moment ago, they aren't just simply events in history, the recording of a time in the ministry of Jesus, but there are things packed into them that we are to glean. And so we're going to see that in this event. Let me give you 5 truths, for lack of a better word, 5 truths that come out of this text from the front end, on the front end, that we're going to glean, and then I'll double back and I'll look at them with you one by one. But here are the 5 truths that we're to glean from this living parable. The first, Jesus sends us into storms. That's the first. The second, Jesus keeps us in storms. Then thirdly, Jesus enters our storms. Fourthly, Jesus teaches us by use of storms. And then finally, Jesus calms our storms. So let's go to the text. Like I said, Matthew 14, we're looking at verses 22 to 33. And as you see, when you look down at verse 22, you can see that our text begins with the word immediately. You see it there? It's actually a word that comes up 2 more times, as we're going to see, in verses 27 and verse 31. A couple of things to note about the use of the word immediately in these 3 instances in this text is that it does 2 things to it. One is it moves it along with a sense of urgency. There is this aspect of immediately, and so you're getting the sense that there's something urgent going on. We need to press on. But in addition to that, each use is connected to something that took place before it, something that it points back to. So let me give you a for example. When you look at verse 22, you see the word immediately there, and what that points back to is what many New Testament theologians state was the most telling of Jesus' messianic signs, meaning the event, the wonder, that demonstrated most dramatically that Jesus was who he claimed he was. What is that messianic sign that this points back to? Well, if you just look up in your text, it points back to the feeding of the 5,000. The feeding of the 5,000, which in fact was probably a feeding of more like 10 or 15,000 people, telling not only because of its scope, meaning that a lot of people took part in it. In fact, every single person took part in it. They didn't just observe it, they actually tasted it. You have that many people, so it's telling because of its scope, but more than that, it's telling because of what it invoked in the minds of those who were there. Now let me explain this. If you were a devout Jew at the time of Christ, meaning that you were well read, and you know your story of your people and the story of God, and God's working in your people and the promises of God, you would know then full well that someone was promised to come, a Messiah. A Messiah was promised to come, and you would have been living in great expectation of that. Yet you longed for it. You had this yearning for the Messiah to come, to reestablish your people, to fulfill the promises of God. And so you, as a devout Jew living your life at that time, hear about this person who's come. This one who teaches like no other teacher, teaches with authority, who's doing things that are dramatic, that are telling, that are wonderful. In addition to that, is making claims that only God could do. Only claims that he could make. You hear about this one and you say to yourself, I want to check him out for myself. I want to see who this individual is. And so one day, as you're following him, you find yourself, and I want you to notice, take a look at verse 13, you find yourself in a desolate place. Think wilderness. With masses of people. But at the end of the day, you have nothing to eat. But not to worry, this one that you're following is taking care of everything with seemingly very little. It's wondrous, with leftovers, right? Feeds the masses with leftovers. How much was left over? Well, 12. Not 11, not 13, 12 baskets full of leftovers. You, as one living in expectation of this one coming, what would you think? You think he's here. This one at long last is here. The Messiah has come to establish his kingdom. The Messiah is here. The one that was promised to come has arrived. Come to your people made up of how many tribes? 12. Who has in their story a story of wilderness type journey, the Exodus in a desolate place, a story that has packed into it what? The feeding of the masses with manna from heaven. Finally, he's here. And that's why people suggest strongly that this is the most telling messianic sign pre-resurrection. But remember, they had no expectation of the resurrection of a Messiah. They had no expectation of the death of a Messiah. So this is pre-resurrection. You would think he's finally here. The one you've been longing for is finally here. So what's the issue? Well, the issue is the crowd didn't grasp the full extent of Jesus' messiahship. And nor did they grasp the full extent or the type of kingdom that he was going to usher in. So when you take that messiahship, that misconception of his messiahship and the misconception of the kind of kingdom he was going to usher in, and then you couple this with their self-interest, their great self-interest, when you couple it with their great self-interest and their hatred of the Roman tyranny, when you bring it all together, this leads to what John records as taking place in the immediate aftermath of this event. And you can read this on the screens to the side. But in John 6:15, we read that perceiving then that they were about to come and take Jesus by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. They thought our worries are over. Food worries over. Tyranny of the Romans over. We've got our king. And he's a miracle worker to boot. I mean, our issues are over. We'll set him up by force if need be, and we'll make him take care of our needs. They had much to learn. But so too did Jesus' disciples. I say that based on Mark's account of this event, where again, in the aftermath of this event, as Mark records it, and again, you can read this on the screens, Mark ends his account of this event by writing, and Jesus got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. And they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. And so what does Jesus do in the tense aftermath of this event? Take a look at verse 22. Immediately, notice it, immediately. All of this is going on. Immediately, he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. I want you to feel the protection of Jesus in this. This is Jesus protecting his disciples from being carried along by way of the crowds. You have much to learn still. I want you out of here now. I don't want you carried along by the crowd. I have much to teach you still. And his teaching begins first, going to those 5 truths that I want to help us see come out of this text. His teaching begins first by sending them into a storm. And what does Jesus do as he sends them off? Well, notice verse 23. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. Perhaps the greatest miracle, by the way, in this event is one that's not even recorded. I mean, the greatest miracle perhaps that takes place in this event that we're going to look at over these next few verses is the fact that Jesus, all by himself, in the midst of a pack of people who want to take him by force, gets out of there. But he does. He gets out of there, and what does he do? He goes and he prays. We don't read here what he prayed for, but I think we can assume some things. I'm sure he prayed for the crowds who still didn't get it. And I'm sure he prayed for the ministry that was going to take place, where he was going to go into predominantly Gentile territory. The feeding of the 4,000 is about to happen. I also believe he prays for the ongoing strength that was necessary coming by way of the onslaught, necessary because of the onslaught of the enemy and those the enemy was using. But I have to think that he must have prayed for the disciples and the storm that they had just entered. So after an evening of prayer, we read this taking place next in verse 24. But the boat by this time was a long way from land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. Now, as I've mentioned a couple of times already, there are several accounts of this event in different Gospels. In this Gospel, we read that they were beaten by the waves, right? See that in verse 24. They were beaten by the waves. But in Mark's account, he tells us that they were making headway painfully. And in John's account, he tells us that the sea was rough. In other words, this is a big, bad boy storm. This is a difficult situation, a rough, hard, painful, arduous journey, and make no mistake, Jesus sent them into it. Now, I know what the skeptic might say when I say that. How can you say Jesus sent them into the storm? Maybe Jesus didn't know a storm was going to happen, right? It just surfaces like storms surface. I just don't agree with that pushback. I don't agree with that pushback for a couple of reasons. One is because the Gospels record for us several situations where Jesus has foreknowledge of events taking place. Yes, I agree that Jesus self-limits. According to Philippians chapter 2, he self-limits. He doesn't grasp those things that are rightfully his. Yet at the same time, we do see instances where Jesus knew things before they took place. For example, the betrayal of Judas. In fact, he knew Judas was going to betray him before he even chose him. We read about the denial of Peter. He foretold, telling Peter, "You're going to deny me before the rooster crows." In addition, going into Jerusalem for the last time, Jesus states on numerous occasions, this is what's going to take place when I get there. So for that reason, I have to believe that Jesus knew what was going to take place. But more than that, the reason why I believe that Jesus sent them into this storm is because it's in the MO of God to send us into storms. It's what he does, at least at times. It's in the very nature and practice of God to send us into storms. Storms not of our doing, although there are storms that are many times created by us, but storms that he creates. Storms not meant to punish us, though, but to teach us and to mold us and to build us. I mean, think about Abraham and the sacrifice of Isaac in Genesis 22:1. God tested Abraham. And what about Job? Job was brought before Satan by God himself. Have you considered my servant Job? What about Paul in 2 Corinthians 12? There was given me a messenger of Satan because why? I have a tendency perhaps to get arrogant. I've had these visions, but a messenger of Satan was given to me so that I would not become arrogant, but remain humble. What about Jesus himself in Matthew 4, verse 1? The Spirit led him into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. It's his practice to test us, to build us, to mold us. Now, if this creates some internal tension for you as you consider and think about the possibility of God sending us into storms, then let me add to it. Let me add to your tension by saying that not only does Jesus send us into storms, but number two, the second truth that I want us to see out of this text is that Jesus keeps us in storms as well. Take a look at verse 25. We read in verse 25, and in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus came to them walking on the sea. Let's just stop there for a moment. What's a watch of the night? Well, a watch of the night was a 3-hour block of time, and it began at around 6 p.m, dusk. And so the fourth watch of the night occurred between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. So just timeline this with me. We've had dinner before, right? 5,000 plus. Having eaten the evening before, the disciples are sent off. Jesus leaves and he goes to pray. He prays for the evening, big storm hits, but Jesus takes his merry time getting to his disciples. Waits almost till daybreak, in fact, somewhere between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. Conservatively, the disciples would have been on the water for about 6, 7, 8, perhaps even 9 hours for a trip that should have been a quick and easy one. And listen to this tidbit, again, coming from Mark's gospel account of this event. We read in Mark 6, verse 48, and Jesus saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. And about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. And then notice this, he meant to pass by them. I mean, what is going on? Jesus could see before he even hit the water that they were struggling, but no biggie, he was going to plan to just walk on by anyway. This is the antithesis of the footprint poem. Remember the footprint poem, right? Posters everywhere. They sold millions of the posters. The footprint poem, when things are going difficult in my life, this is when Jesus, carries me, right, through the difficulties. This is the antithesis. In this version of the footprint poem, when you see, your feet by themselves, they're actually by themselves with Jesus' feet kind of veering around the side, right? They should write that poem because you would sell tens of them, right? That's this poem. That's what's taking place here. Jesus going by, or perhaps going by, that was his intention. Please understand what's taking place here. Jesus sends them into a storm. He watches them in the storm. He leaves them in the storm and is about to walk by while they battle the storm. That's where we are here. The question is why? Well, the answer is because they had something to learn. They had something to learn about themselves, but more pointedly, they had something to learn about how they viewed Jesus that only a storm could teach. And oftentimes that is true for us as well. Now, before you conclude that Jesus is some sort of cruel puppet master, I want you to note that Jesus doesn't only send us and keep us in our storms, but the third truth coming out of this text is that he enters our storms too. But not before scaring the disciples first. Just notice again verses 25 and this time verse 26. And in the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It's a ghost." And they cried out in fear. That word ghost is way too soft. It's the Greek word phantasma. It really speaks of evil spirits. So not only were they afraid because of the storm, dealing with this storm, but they were now thinking that they were being visited by something demonic. Let me ask you a question at this point. Does your theology have room enough for a God who was willing to put you in places of fear where all you can do is cry out? Do you have room for a God who loves you that much? Now, how can I say love you that much? What are you talking about, love you that much? Put me in a place where I scream out in fear that I have to cry out. I mean love you enough to confront those things in your life that only a storm can, causing you to cry out so as to be deepened, broadened, strengthened, and matured. Love you that much. Does your theology have room for a God like that? Or is your theology one where God only exists to provide you with food with leftovers and to make sure that your life is only smooth sailing thereafter? Many people have that view of God. Take care of my needs, make sure that life is smooth. But what we see here with Jesus is a push into that. I'm putting you into this place where you're at wit's end, where you struggle and where you cry out. For there's something that needs to be taught, again, that only this storm could teach. Jesus, our God, is the type of God who not only sends his disciples into storms, but leaves them to battle on their own until they realize the folly of doing so. He's also the type of God who takes disciples to places where all they can do is cry out in fear. But look at verse 27. But immediately. Remember that word? They're crying out in fear, but immediately. But immediately Jesus spoke. Don't miss that. Don't miss that. They cry out in fear, but immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." Jesus is also this type of God. A God who enters our storms and responds to our cries, which leads to the fourth truth that comes out of this event, and that is Jesus enters our storms and teaches us in the midst of them. I've inferred to this already, but let's look specifically at what Jesus sets out to teach his disciples. His teaching begins in verse 27, the verse I just read, with his reply, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid, it is I." That phrase, "it is I," in the Greek is ego eimi, literally, I am. Take heart, I am. It is the name of God introduced to Moses in the burning bush. In the Hebrews, heya, where Moses, in his conversation, in his call to set his people free, asks God, "Who should I say sent me?" And God responds, "Tell them I am sent you." It's the name of God that speaks of God's self-existence, I am that I am, but it's also the name of God that is introduced as God responds to the cries of his people. Isn't that what's taking place? That's what's taking place here. Immediately Jesus spoke. Immediately he responded to the cries of fear. That's what's taking place here. The cries of his people being heard, and he enters their plight. So what is Jesus teaching his disciples in the midst of this storm? Well, he's teaching them that he's not some sort of divine pantry or glorified food truck. He's teaching them that you can't force them into position to secure your comfort. He's teaching them that he's not some sort of genie in a bottle. But he's also teaching them that he is the great I am, for whom the very molecules that make up bread and fish replenish themselves with his command to do so. That's who he is. The great I am, for whom the very density of water recalibrates itself when he commands it to do so. The great I am, as they are about to see, for whom the very wind and the waves die down when he commands them to do so. But he's also the great I am who enters their storm. It's wondrous. We worship a God who not only reveals, but enters, comes. Doesn't toss advice from afar, but comes. Peter got it. Peter got it, at least for a little while. Take a look at what takes place in verses 28 and 29. And Peter answered him, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. Jesus said, come. So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. Let's just stop there. Now, before we hammer Peter, and we'll get to verse 30. Verse 30 is coming. We know how this event ends if you've ever read it before. Don't miss out on the fact that at least he got out of the boat. At least from the 12, he was the one that left. The 11 others didn't. Don't miss that. Did he fail later? Sure he did. We're going to see that as we get into verse 30. But I guarantee he learned far more in his trying and failing than the other 11 did by not trying at all. I don't know about you, personally speaking, in terms of how you view people and those that you like to spend time with, but I would much rather run with people who have failed than those who have never attempted anything at all. At least he attempted. Rick Warren made a statement that I just love in connection to this. There's only one thing worse than failing, and that is the fear of failing. We must risk failing. Peter risked failing. We don't know how long he walked on the water. What we do know, however, is that as you gaze down at verse 30, that when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. Again, just stop there. This part of the text, verse 30 specifically, is what most people point out as being the most important application coming out of this event. And that application is when, in the midst of our storms, we take our eyes off of Jesus and focus instead on the storm, we will sink. That's what most people, when they look at this, that's what happened to Peter. Peter took his eyes off Jesus and he began to sink. Therefore, our lives, we should always gaze at Jesus and we won't sink. We should always keep our eyes on Christ. Now, that by itself, I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think that's good application. It's very true, as Hebrews 12:2 states, that we are to look and fix our eyes on Jesus, but I don't think it goes deep enough. I think there is more still that we're to take in from this event, especially with what's taking place with Peter. Just notice verse 31. This is why I say that. Verse 31, Jesus immediately, there's our word again, Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" Why did I doubt? What do you mean, why did I doubt? I've never walked on the water before. What are you talking about? Why did I doubt? I don't know. I've never done this before, and there's a big storm all around me. That's why I doubted. That's why I doubted. That's why I began to sink. That's why I doubted. So maybe that's the answer Peter wanted to give, but I don't believe that's why Peter doubted and began to sink. I think Peter doubted and began to sink because he viewed the storm as being bigger than Jesus. Too big even for Jesus. Peter didn't doubt and sink because the storm was too big and the waves too rough and the wind too hard. Peter doubted and sank because his Jesus, meaning his view of Jesus, his understanding of Jesus, his perception of Jesus was too small. If he had a clear understanding of who Jesus was, it wouldn't matter the size of the storm or the waves or the wind. So too when it comes to us as we encounter our storms. Jesus asks many questions that are recorded for us in the Gospels. But most often when they are asked for our sake, not his. So when Jesus asked Peter, "Why did you doubt?" he knew full well Peter's predicament. What he wanted to know from Peter was why. With the "I am with you," did you doubt? Peter, I called you. I'm with you. Your Lord is with you. Why did you doubt? I just fed 15,000 plus people with 5 loaves and 2 fish. Why did you doubt? I just came to you in the storm by walking on the water. Why did you doubt? I command the very nuances of creation, and they bow in deference to me, and I just called you. No, I commanded you to come. So why then, Peter, in light of all of that, why did you doubt? He asks us the same question. Same question. The question that he asked Peter here is the question that he asks us. As we go through storms especially, why are you doubting? I'm with you. I've entered this. I'm walking with you in this. Why do you doubt? Why do you take your eyes off me? Why do you doubt? Why do you think this is too big for me? Why do you doubt? Why does Jesus send us into storms, keep us in storms, and even allow for heightened fear in storms? For most often, only a storm will show us the kind of faith and belief we have. Calm times don't beg the kind of questions that are getting posed here. Storms show us how we truly view Jesus. They spotlight how we respond in the midst of them too. Which leads to the final point, the final truth that I want to highlight coming out of this living parable, and that is Jesus calms our storms. Picking things up in verse 31 again, let me read to verse 32. Through verse 32, Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. So Jesus sends, he leaves, he enters, he teaches, and finally he calms. Maybe not right away, but he does, and he will. In fact, he took our place in the ultimate of storms so that we could forever enjoy peace. What is our call? Our call is to turn our eyes back to Jesus and to take hold of his hand. That's a beautiful picture. He reaches out and he takes hold of his hand. Same call for us. As I wrap this up, you don't have to be a master theologian to recognize the obvious questions of application coming out of this text, do you? I mean, there are so many. This is one of those texts that is very easy to come up with applications coming out of it. Are you in the middle of any storms right now? I mean, I heard some of the prayer requests and some of the things going on. And so in as much as I know about you, the little that I know about you, I know that some of you in hearing your stories are going through storms right now. Taking on water? Do you feel like you're sinking? Feeling faithless? Fearful? Doubt-filled? I ask you the same question that Jesus asked Peter. Why do you doubt? Why do you doubt? Could it possibly be that it's not the size of the storm that's your problem, but the size of the God you've created? Crawford Loritz states that courage isn't the absence of fear, but where it's directed. We either direct our fear toward the storm, or we direct our fear towards the Lord of the storm. Our choice. Where is your fear being directed? Fear, in fact, is a form of idolatry where we make more of it than Jesus himself. So where are you looking? For those of you that are going through difficulty right now, the storms of life right now, where are you looking? What is it revealing? What is it evidencing? One final thing to note about this living parable is that it doesn't end with Peter and Jesus climbing into the boat. It actually ends with worship. Notice verse 33. And those in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." That's how every encounter with Jesus should end, shouldn't it? With worship. Truly you are the Son of God. Let me pray for us. Jesus, we have heard from you by way of your word. We have heard from you by way of the Spirit you sent that illumines the word. But we are called not to be mere hearers of the word, but doers of it. Knowledge by itself puffs up, but wisdom is made known by love for you and love for others. So I pray that in response to what we've heard by way of the word today, that we would respond in ways that honor you and further us along. Further us along in, from one degree to the next, further Christ-likeness. Further us along in the laying aside of things that are hindering us and chasing instead those things that are good and right and pure and lovely. I pray for individuals here today that are going through a storms that come. I pray that they would be strengthened to, if they have taken their eyes off you, to redirect them to you, run to you, take hold of your hand and receive your ongoing grace, your strengthening grace. I pray that they would. And I pray that in the midst of this, they wouldn't waste the storms that they're going through, storms that reveal things that need to be revealed. So I pray for them, and I pray for us that perhaps it's smooth sailing right now, but perhaps a storm is coming. So I pray that this would not be remembered forgotten in the dark when those times do come. Bless this ministry, I pray. Bless the leadership of it. I pray that they would continue to make an impact in this part of the Lower Mainland for the sake of your name. Use them, I pray, for your glory. And I pray for these things in the great name of Jesus. Amen.